You've already made it sound as though I'm going to preach, but usually when I speak, there's always someone who says that wasn't really a sermon at all. Now, this may be a good thing or a bad, tell me later, but I hadn't planned it as a conventional sermon. The morning after December's first Wednesday, as Stan was indicating before, my house caught fire. Since when, matters have not gone smoothly with the insurance company. So it's with feeling I say to you, read the small print. There are people who are reluctant to take the trouble or who are nervous about what they might find or not find. Nevertheless, it's good advice. And hopefully you agree, because reading the small print is what we're going to do tonight. Our passage, start of the 8th chapter of John's Gospel, is the story, theologians a bit pompously like to call it the pericope, of the woman taken in adultery. Although I'll be informing you that actually she wasn't an adulteress. Not quite. In many modern editions of the Bible, the episode appears only in small print, in a reduced font size, or as a footnote, an addendum, an appendix, bracketed. Sometimes it's asterisked. There's some sort of disclaimer. I've no idea. Sorry, can people hear? Okay, my sister goes getting deaf. Speaking of disclaimers, exculpate Stan. He's responsible neither for picking this passage nor for what I'll say. Direct any comments or criticisms straight to me. I chose it, and I chose it for 3 reasons: aesthetic, moral, textual. First, an aesthetic reason. Although it's so familiar to us, certain nuances do tend to go unnoticed, but still the narrative is dramatic in what Jesus does, equally for what he doesn't do, despite the situation being desperate, virtually fatal, and not just for the woman, for Jesus too. Second, a moral reason. The passage is pointed. Now, I'm not going to press that. If I were to try, most likely I'd seem to be throwing stones myself. And besides, surely each of us can already sense all too easily our moral place, or places, in the story. But thirdly, a textual reason for choosing it. And this I do intend to press, because it leads to an uncomfortable conclusion, which we have to recognize, even if it is uncongenial. But because it's uncongenial, I'll leave that to the end and now consider the passage itself. Let me mention 3 of the background nuances. The Feast of Tabernacles, which immediately preceded this episode, and then I'll talk about the trap laid for Jesus, and thirdly, the trial itself. The Feast of Tabernacles. It was a week-long commemoration, a commemoration of God saving the Jews from slavery in Egypt and bringing them to the Promised Land. And because that exodus had been through the desert, the celebration featured water as a physical symbol for spiritual release and restoration. Water welcomed with the excitement and relief that it receives when sighted in a parched land. There were daily processions, fetching from the pool of Siloam water to be poured as a morning sacrifice over the temple's altar. Psalms were chanted, and daily, by all accounts, the celebration would grow more and more festive, almost frenetic, till by the final day there was splashing, water fights, puddles everywhere. As Isaiah said, with joy you will draw water down from the wells of salvation. By the last day, the whole thing was fun. And then suddenly, the day before our episode, at the festival's climax, with everyone laughing and joking, Jesus brazenly stands up and appropriates all this celebration to himself, crying out, "Let those who thirst come to me." Thus he declares himself, I'm not really sure how to describe it, a sort of oasis of the soul, Those who thirst, come to me. And as you might expect, it ignited extremes of reaction. Some said, surely this is Messiah. Others, outraged, sent the temple guards to arrest him, and then rebuked the guards for returning empty-handed and lamely saying, but no one ever spoke like that. That's the immediate background. That's why tensions were so high on the morning of our story. Because the next day, Jesus has the temerity to go back into the temple where they'd been trying to arrest him. And because he's gone back, the trap is sprung. Will this upstart endorse the Mosaic law at the woman's expense? If he fails to, he's no true Jew, he forfeits the popular support, the temple guards can then take him. On the other hand, if he endorses the Mosaic law, the Romans in their tower overlooking the temple precincts would know it, and they would come to take him, because under Roman jurisdiction, no Jew could issue or even threaten death against anyone. That's why, of course, later, when the Sanhedrin want Jesus killed, they have to embroil Herod and Pilate. Jesus is trapped. Either he loses Jewish support, or he endorses the Mosaic law, and the Romans come for him. And the trap had a second strand. People used to be puzzled by Jesus' actions, stooping down, actually sitting down in the Greek, and scribbling in the sand. But it's not a puzzle anymore. Research discovered what the formal procedure for a trial was in those days. The judge began by sitting down and writing the accusation, and eventually writing the verdict. That's what was written. The eighth day, however, the day after a week-long feast, would have been a rest day. And, according to the interpretations of the law then current, you couldn't do any work. You could not write more than 2 letters. So you see the trap. Either Jesus will be accused of not following proper legal procedure, in which case they'll dismiss him as not knowing what he's doing, or he follows legal procedure and will be told, but you're doing something on the Sabbath that is work. You can't do it. That's the second line of the trap. And that's why I said, faced either with the prospect of temple guards taking him or Romans taking him, that actually this episode could have been easily as fatal for Jesus as it threatened to be for the woman. Now the trial itself, it's a travesty, of course, isn't it? The verdict they've declared before it begins. This woman is to be found guilty. The target and the intended victim isn't the woman. The target is the person they elevate to be the judge. It's the judge who's being tried. As for the law invoked, well, there's no evidence that it had ever been regularly applied. And certainly, those calling for Jesus to uphold it hadn't themselves applied it under Roman jurisdiction. They weren't allowed to. The woman is brought out, but the man who'd been involved should have been brought out too, and there's no signs of him. And one other thing, I said she wasn't strictly an adulteress. The penalty for adultery, in the way it was interpreted by Jesus' day, was strangulation. Stoning was specifically the penalty if the woman was not yet married, if she was only betrothed. It strikes me as too awful a coincidence that the scribes and Pharisees should drag forward a woman in the position that Mary, Jesus' mother, must have appeared to some to have been in. It's just another barb, I think, in their trap. How Jesus evades those traps is astonishing. Sexual offences, of course, aren't the worst kind of offence, but they do naturally symbolize infidelity towards God. What does Jesus do? He takes the offered position as judge and simply transcends law and morality. He puts himself above law and morality. Again, it would have invited people either to acclaim him or to be aghast. he simply recasts the whole issue solely as a spiritual matter before God, recasts it in the simplest and most comprehensive terms as one of sin before God. And then he shows that God will acquit you, will make you free, that actually what matters isn't our fidelity towards God, but rather God's endless fidelity towards us, if we will receive it. As for the writing trap, well, actually it was permitted to write in the dust. But by doing so, Jesus, and I'm sure this was deliberate, was echoing a prophecy from Jeremiah. Echoing it and tying it to what he had done himself the day before. This is what Jeremiah wrote, none too hopeful, by the way. O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust. Or the Hebrew can be translated, will be written in the underworld, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. Jeremiah talks about God as the hope of Israel, but there isn't actually much hope in the verse, except this mention of living water. But what Jesus does, how did I describe him earlier, rather rashly, oasis of the soul. What Jesus does is offer renewed life to someone, this woman, who is in the dust, virtually in the underworld. That old image from Genesis of God making man out of the dust of the earth. And here we have him virtually remaking this woman from the dust of the earth by writing in the dust his judgment, which is no condemnation. Jesus sits down in the dust. In that eyewitness detail are embodied so many Christian doctrines that later get spelled out. Jesus as judge. Jesus also as defending advocate, transcending morality and convention, numbered with sinners, descended into the underworld, descended to hell, risen up again to issue no condemnation, making the fallen independent and free. You notice he saves her from the accusers. Is anyone left who accuses you? Accuser was one of the Hebrew terms for the devil. Lucifer, Satan, the adversary, the accuser, the father of lies. But in what sense is the devil father of lies? All too often what the devil whispers in my ear is true. He tells me, Paul, you've been a bad boy again. All too often it is true. The devil's lie isn't in saying something untrue about ourselves. All too often it is true. The lie consists in hinting that, and that's God's final word about you too. His lie is in making God out to be limited to our misdeeds, whereas God actually transcends them. The lie is about God, not about us. Now, I said I was leaving till last a textual reason I had for picking this passage. It's a beautiful passage, but it is also the worst in the whole New Testament, textually speaking. There are linguistic features in it that often occur in the other Gospels, but oddly enough, not in John. And a couple of them you could notice even in translation. You'll see that they mention the Mount of Olives by name. Never happens otherwise in John. You'll notice he talks of scribes and Pharisees. John never otherwise does that. Moreover, the passage is corrupt. There are 183 words of it in Greek and a huge number, it's over 80, textual variants. That's a way, way greater proportion than any other passage. Actually, they make next to no difference to the real meaning of the text. And that too is curious. So many little variations, and yet no great change in meaning. But it's the next textual problem that's the real humdinger. The reason why the pericope is so problematical, so disputed, the reason it's often only published in small print, is because in all the best biblical manuscripts, it isn't there. Now, in medieval Europe, the pericope was included in Bibles because Jerome had included it in the Vulgate. The Vulgate is the old Latin translation of the Bible, which Jerome in the 4th century was commissioned to make by the Vatican. He included it because he said, I've looked at many Latin and Greek manuscripts, and it's there. But you'll notice the wording. If I've seen it in many manuscripts, it does suggest that maybe there were others that didn't have it. Certainly Augustine, writing about 10 years later than Jerome, says, certain people of little faith, or rather enemies of the true faith, fearing, I suppose, lest their wives should be given impunity in sinning, removed from their manuscripts the Lord's act of forgiveness towards the adulteress, in order to avoid the impression that Christ sanctioned adultery, as if he who said, sin no more, had granted permission to sin. Don't underestimate how contentious forgiveness is. And it's very desirable for oneself. It can be very debatable when people want it extended to others. 2nd and 3rd century Christians split over forgiveness. They were themselves suffering disdain, often persecution, and they reacted to that rightly by being exemplary. The trouble is, a few of them took that too far and made good, almost perfect behaviour a precondition of staying in the church. And this led to schism, the Novatian and Donatist schisms, over what to do with people who, well, couldn't maintain impeccable standards. What should we do? Some of them would delay baptism till their deathbed. If I don't know if I can be forgiven if I go on sinning, maybe I shouldn't get baptized till there's no time to sin anymore. Because there was a big dispute. We are forgiven, but is that once or once and for all? And what do we do with people who very publicly are known to have sinned? Do we just let them back into the church on a par with other people? Do we let them occupy prominent church positions? Would you warmly welcome as minister the chap from my theological college who murdered his mother? What would you do if an Irish priest, known to have been a paedophile, were not only shielded by bishops but was appointed to become one? What should my fellow Anglicans feel about homosexuals in America, promoted to the purple and now controlling diocese? Forgiveness is a great principle, but it can sometimes in practice be difficult to know how far to extend it. Augustine would say we always forgive the sin. It can be difficult to know how far we let the sinner into positions where maybe they might sin again. There were people in Christianity, as Augustine indicated, who'd rather it weren't broadcast how Christ acted in this pericope. Rome favoured a soft line. After all, her patron was Peter. She was unlikely to say that people couldn't easily be forgiven. So in the Roman Empire, the pericope became easily accepted in the Roman West. The trouble is, as more and more manuscripts were found, it began to look as though the pericope might not have been original. There's no question the story was known amongst the earliest Christians. It was certainly known in Syria and in the West in the 3rd century. There's even a probable reference to it from Papias in about 120, and he'd actually talked to people who knew the apostles. The trouble is, these are Christian writers, but no actual biblical text with the pericope in has survived. No biblical text earlier than one that's kept at Cambridge from the 5th century, known as Codex Bezae. Against that, both the manuscripts that are thought best, Vaticanus, which is in Rome, and Sinaiticus, most of which is in the British Museum, they omit the pericope altogether. So do the 2 best papyri we have from the 3rd century. Yet strange, all 4 of them in the margin have what scholars call diacritical marks, like an obolus or an asterisk, and those probably indicate that the scribes knew that other people inserted a passage there. It's strange, too, that half a dozen other manuscripts, and nearly all the Armenian ones, have the pericope but relocate it. They just have it dangling at the end of John's Gospel. Another manuscript has it halfway through the previous chapter, another 3/4 of the way through the previous chapter. A small group have it not in John at all, but in Luke, where it's linked with the attempt to trap Jesus over paying tribute money. Especially strange is the silence in the Eastern Church. It's not in their lectionary readings. During Pentecost, their lectionary covers the chapters of John around this, but miss out this particular bit. Moreover, there's no Greek-speaking church father mentions the pericope at all till the 12th century. Or at least that's what scholars used to think till the Second World War. Then, 1941, someone found in Egypt some manuscripts in which it was undoubtedly quoted by a 3rd century writer called Didymus the Blind. He's the chap who actually founded the theological school in Alexandria. He quotes the pericope with real joy and excitement. And isn't that odd? The founder of their school loved the passage, and then for 8 centuries no one mentions it. That's as long as from the 12th century to us. Now, those are the basic bits of the textual problem, and it leaves us with 2 alternatives. Both are pretty awful. Either we have to say that the pericope gets imported into Bibles centuries after the rest of John was written, or we have to say that it was taken out systematically, and only quite a time subsequently did it make its way back. The truth is that there isn't quite enough evidence to come to one conclusion or the other. I admit that mostly my fellow theologians tend to say that it's late, that it's not original John, and they do this because mostly their method is to take one manuscript and compare it with another. Do that, and invariably you're going to use as your criteria Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, the 2 oldest manuscripts. But that really begs the question. What if the problem preceded Vaticanus and Sinaiticus? Is it possible that someone really removed the passage? It would have to have been done really systematically. Yeah, there were schismatics who hated the passage, who didn't like this graphic demonstration of Jesus' forgiveness. But the schismatics couldn't have done what was necessary. What did you need to do? Remove it from a lot of Bibles. Have it omitted from all the Bibles that were then being written. You have to have that policy maintained for a couple of centuries at the very least, longer in the Eastern Church, so that when the pericope started being put in again, many minor variations developed, particularly in the bits linking it to the rest of John. Could it have happened? I think it could, and I'm going to tell you very briefly the rather ugly story of how I believe this problem occurred. You've got to look for someone who had power enough to do that, opportunity and motive. There is one man. The West calls him great. The East doesn't just call him a saint, it calls him Is Apostolikos, equal of the apostles. The 13th apostle, begging Matthias and St. Paul's pardon. Constantine began by restoring church property, went on to make Christianity, for better or worse, the religion of the state. He even presided over church councils, though his grasp of doctrine was shaky and though he wasn't baptized till his deathbed. He had unprecedented power over the state, also over the church, which was so much indebted to him. If anyone had the power to do this, Constantine had. As a young pagan rising through the ranks, he saw the Emperor Diocletian burning Bibles everywhere he could find them. Later, when Constantine is emperor, he commissions 50 great Bibles to be written. Tischendorf, who found Sinaiticus, was convinced it was one of them. If anyone had opportunity to have Bibles written without this passage, it was Constantine. But did he have the motive? Alas. Constantine had a son by his first marriage, Crispus. Constantine had him poisoned. A few weeks later, he had his wife killed. She was having a bath, and he arranged for the steam to be heated and heated and heated, and she was boiled to death. Why? It's believed that his son by the first marriage and his second wife were having an affair. What he did was to issue a sentence, the French would call it civil death. All references to them were erased. Anything that might have referred to them or brought them to mind was erased. And not just Constantine. All three of Fausta's sons refused to have her mentioned at all. All three of them became emperors. There's not enough evidence to be conclusive, but I think if anyone could have had this particular passage taken out because of the sympathy to the adulteress, it may have been Constantine. And yet, I didn't tell you the strangest thing about this passage. Lots of scholars doubt whether it's by John, but even the ones who doubt it look at the passage and they say, but here we see Jesus. What we see, whether it's by John or not, is all of a piece with what we know of Jesus. And that's all of a piece with what we know of God. Print it in small print if you don't think John wrote it. But there's really no serious doubt that it is gospel. And that's the point I wanted to finish with. Does it matter too much that the text hasn't been perfectly transmitted? Does it matter too much that the church's involvement in that may have been shady or even wrong? What matters is that the biblical text, a bit cloudy in parts, I would admit, is still sufficient for us to see Jesus, to see his impact, to see the effect he has on lives. It's not a perfect text, but it's sufficient for us to try and share that experience. Because at the end of the day, what is our belief? Is it belief in the historical conclusions of a book? It might include that. Is it belief in an ideology or a creed? Well, it might include that. But finally, it's the experience of a person. The book may be imperfect, the church certainly is, but they can do enough to point us to Jesus, and then we get to know him ourselves. Our faith is based on an experience in the end, isn't it? An experience of a person. We have to... Stan asked me, how did your religion develop as you were a little boy and growing up? Well, basically, doesn't it develop from being something we know with our head to being a relationship we have with a God? When I was about 16 and first at school started reading serious theologians, I encountered Kierkegaard. I remember being wonderfully shocked when, I got towards the end of a chapter and he was clearly building up to saying why he, a very sophisticated thinker indeed, why he believed in God. And then there it was in just one line, and at the time I was so disappointed. He said, and I believe in God because he saved me. He could have given umpteen other reasons, and in other books he does. But ultimately we believe in him because we experience his salvation. Remember, religion is a really odd thing. It's contradictory. You must have noticed. All religion is based on a contradiction, and here it is. On the one hand, a pure God. On the other hand, less than pure people. And yet, they come together. Christianity is the only religion, I think, that explains that. Others will try and water down the purity of God, or maybe minimize the impurity of us. Only Christianity looks both those facts square in the eye and sees that Jesus does actually bridge the two. I'd leave you with Kierkegaard's words that our religion is not just a historical book. It's not just the witness of the church and other Christians. It's experiencing the one who saves us.